In this segment, we're going to talk about written communication and some do's and don'ts and some tips in how to do better as we deal with cultures and international environments. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And here we go. So written communication patterns. When you're dealing in international business and multiple languages, how do you decide which language the communication is going to be in? And who is the expert in that language in your company so that you can communicate most effectively? So we often hear, right, international English. English is the international language of business, and yet we must keep in mind that it is not the area of expertise of every person or every company that we may be interacting with. So careful usage of language is very important. There are some very good guidelines in your textbook and a lot of examples in your book that I'm not necessarily going to show here. Today I'm going to keep this very, very brief and talk mostly about the key points that we need to be aware of. Okay. So letters in the business environment are very important. Not every culture accepts emails in the same way that we have adopted here in the US. And so we may need to follow up with a formal letter after the back and forth of the conversation is over via email. And a lot of cultures, a lot of countries don't acknowledge the legal binding nature of an email either. So you may need to fax a letter to them or mail it in addition to something that you attach to an email. So understanding where a company executive stands on that and what the general sentiment is. Some of it is dictated from above. So learn the basics of formal written communication for the country you are wanting to do business in. Even if you are writing in English, if you want your letter to be well received, it needs to have the formalities of that language, of that country. So make the proper adjustments. Consider differences in how we write date and time, the differences in salutations and closings, the pacing of a letter, the formality of a letter. So I wanted to give you an example, and I believe it's in the book. I studied French and was certified in French in business French by the French government at one point. And this meant that one of the things I had to master was all of the formality of the French language, where, for example, in a letter in English, we might go straight to the point of the letter and at the end just close out with sincerely. The French have formulas that are paragraphs that must be included so that you write appropriately and you don't offend them. And I don't see the example here right now, but be aware of those. And there are so many countries that have different formalities and letters, even like titles. Be sure you address people properly with their titles. An ambassador is His or Her Excellency, the ambassador of the United States, dear Madam Ambassador, dear Mr. Ambassador, the Honorable so and so, um, if you're writing charge d'affaires. The consul general is the Honorable so and so. So anyway, be sure to understand the formality, and even if you're not writing in their language, you need to follow the format that's acceptable in that country. So this becomes very important. Using what we call in America military time and military date is more standard worldwide than what we typically do. One big confusion with dates is when we abbreviate and we say like the day this class started, right, July 6, 2020. In the US, we're going to put 7/6/2020. Okay. So month, day, year. In the majority of the world, you write date, month, year. And so they would look at it and think it was June 7 instead of July 6. So sometimes abbreviations can be a hindrance, and you're better off writing it all out. And time, always use military time worldwide, unless you've studied and understand that in a different culture they use something differently. Faxes. So I mentioned earlier that not every country accepts emails and attachments to emails. The fax machine is alive and well in many, many countries. And so in a lot of countries, fax is more reliable than mail. And so they're going to put fax above a mailed letter and way above an email. So make sure that you know what the protocol is, and always include a detailed cover sheet when you send a fax. So email. When you're sending emails internationally, treat it formally and follow the protocol of letters. Okay. Americans tend to be very informal, and that is not acceptable in most cultures, in most other countries. These two links here are etiquette rules when it comes to email. So I'll just review a couple of them. Okay, so this is, all these ads are very annoying. Okay, if you're sending from a personal address from a job, for a job application or informational interview, for example, make sure your address is still professional sounding. If you're receiving an angry message or are feeling enraged yourself, step back for a few minutes. Don't write in the heat of the moment, especially not internationally. You could close a deal forever if you made that kind of a mistake. Proofread. Be formal and yet friendly, and follow the same salutations that are acceptable in letters internationally. So most of these tips are not international. Be very careful with reply all, and make sure that you are adjusting those communications appropriately, okay? So that is, here is an example of email etiquette. So here's the client challenge. I was recently contacted by a senior vice president who was looking for email etiquette training. Okay. So the client, the challenges were not surprising. Being overwhelmed by the volume of email, using poor email subject lines, attempting to use humor, and sending long rambling emails. So the client solution, always come up with an easy email structure to write, read, understand, act on, when to use CCs, when to reply versus reply all. Then second, the email content, manage reader expectations. Poor email etiquette can be very destructive to a contract. So I'm going to give you an example, not the best of examples, but a personal example. I was working at a different university, and I was a chair of the business department, and I had two supervisors. Okay, I had my direct supervisor, Dean, who I pretty much relied on for everything, and he was truly my direct report. Okay, but due to the nature, the structure of the university, I had a secondary dean that I reported to for all the graduate programs. Okay, and that person came in new. And I received 3 or 4 emails in the space of 2 days, and each of his emails were literally pages long. They were so long and cumbersome, I just did not carve out the time to read them in detail. The emails were so complex that I literally printed them out, took a highlighter and a red pen to make notes so that I knew what was information, what did I need to respond to, what were his requests, were there multiple requests, etc. And this is among all the rest of my responsibilities, and so I was slow in responding. Part of it was my frustration with the length of his emails. And about 4 or 5 days later, I got on the elevator with him, and he looks at me, he goes, "So what's your answer?" And I was like, "Answer to what? To which one?" And he's like, "I need answers to my emails." And here's the part that I missed in email etiquette, okay? Number one, I should have responded to him and said, "I've seen your emails. I will respond as soon as I get a minute to work through them." Something like that. Still polite, but acknowledging that I received it. I didn't acknowledge. Second, I was dealing with someone of a different culture, of a different way of communicating. And who was going to be the one who needed to adapt? The lower level employee or the higher level employee, right? I needed to adapt to his style. So what I said to him was that I had seen the emails, I had printed them out, and they were sitting on my desk, and I was working through them. Okay. And I hoped that that wasn't something that was, it wasn't said in a disrespectful tone. It was said very respectfully, actually. And I know from history that he took it as, oh, she's really paying attention to this, and she's, she's going to send me a thorough answer. The next issue that arose was that when I responded to his emails, I responded in bullets. And I did not respond in full, lengthy sentences like he was used to. So he ended up in my office complaining to me about my response and how brief it was. And at that point, what do? I was at a loss. I didn't want to be offensive, but I really, really wanted to be truthful with him. And so my response, as polite as I could, was to say, I apologize for the brevity of the response. This was a very busy time, and so I wanted to get back to you as quickly as possible. Could we review those emails and you could tell me where you want me to give you more information? And so I used it as a learning opportunity to start dialoguing with him. Here's the interesting thing. He ran into enough resistance with his lengthy emails that he came back to me and said, so apparently you guys don't like long emails, and several people are upset at me. Could you help me figure out how to do this communication better? And so at that point, we were able to go back and forth in more of an open environment, open communication. And I talked more about the brevity of emails that we expect in the US. He talked about what his style was and why it was important to give all the background and fill us in. But what he took away from that was that he needed to make his points very clear, and that if he could abbreviate his emails, he would get faster responses. And so it was interesting over time to watch how his emails evolved to adjust to us, because he was in a different majority culture, so he needed to make those adjustments. And then we, as his subordinates, needed to learn how to communicate in a way that that honored him and was acceptable to him. So that just gives you a bit of an illustration about how we do need to go back and forth. And yet, if you're dealing with two corporations and you're starting to negotiate, you don't have the friendship to discuss those items very easily. So figuring out what the best means of communication in that situation is going to be your best way of going about that. So another point that I wanted to make is in resume and job searching. So in the US, for the majority of jobs, when you apply, you use a resume. And resume it comes from French, and it means a summary, okay? So what are you summarizing? So typically a resume is one page. You can add a second page if you are at 10 years or more of experience. and you have mid to upper level experience, okay? So it's a one-page summary of your work experience, of your work life. Just a caveat, an aside, I haven't seen it on the schedule yet, but I was informed yesterday, that I'm going to be teaching a job search 1-credit course. It's a supplemental course. It doesn't really help you graduate with your master's. In other words, it's not fulfilling credits, but if you have the space available, this is going to be a course that will walk you through some of these fine points. But anyway, I just thought about that. Most of the world uses a curriculum vitae, and a curriculum vitae does not really have page lengths, although different countries may have preferences. The most important thing to recognize is that if you are applying for a job in a different country, you need to understand what the requirements are in that country. So in the US, if you put personal information on your resume, an employer freaks out because of the liability. So they don't want your age, your sex, your gender, your marital status. They don't want to know any of that kind of personal demographics, because we have very strong anti-discrimination laws, okay? There are countries that you will not be considered if you do not have that information. So pay attention to the type of information that is required in that country if you're ever applying for a job. So those are the main thoughts, ladies and gentlemen, on the formalities of international business communication. I'll see you guys in the next video.